Ladies and gentlemen, 早欢定. I am Jan Siesling, and I want to thank you for organizing the second XuYunuo Forum in Pingdingshan, close to his birthplace. I want to thank you for inviting me, although I can only speak to you in English. But let's not forget that English is the gateway to the world, even for China. That is maybe why I thought that it was very important to open the world to XuYunuo's poetry. And today I will speak about my translation in English of his first little book, 见来这花园, that I can show you here. Maybe you've seen it before. You see, I have translated it in the future garden. That is how I will talk about it today. I will say a few things about the way the book came into being, and also about the knowledge of the world, about XuYunuo, and then introduce you to a few points of, well, my introduction, presentation of the text. You have to know that I was not myself who took the initiative. I was asked to do so by Haiyin and Shidagwan in 2015, I think it was, when Haiyan Tian and I made a trip to Pingdingshan. Haiyin and Shidagwan had published a new edition of the poems of XuYunuo in 2014, and they gave me a copy of the book. Maybe you can see how later everybody signed it. They gave me a copy of the book, and I didn't really know what to do with it because XuYunuo was totally unknown to me. But I was happy to give it a try because for me, translating is also a service to a friend. I worked, however, slowly on it, and don't forget, ever, with Haiyan at my side. But while working on it, I began to understand the importance of this little book, and I felt that I had come upon a discovery for at least my world, not only because of the quality of the poems themselves, but, you know, I am an historian, an art historian, because of its place in the history of poetry. So while I translated, I decided to offer this discovery to the world. I was sure didn't know about XuYunuo, and I wrote an introduction, certainly for the Western public, within my mind also the Chinese public, but in fact, I try to explain to myself why you sometimes think that a poem is more important in quality than another. In 2019, Haiyan and I planned a trip to China again, So I was working hard on finishing a first version of the translation, the first version of the introduction, the presentation. And I made a copy myself, self-printed. Look, I still have one for you. You see, it is pretty big, but only bound in a ring. You see, it's not as prestigious as the other one. But I hoped that I would find maybe somebody interested in China to publish it. However, I also wanted to be published in Europe or in America. But in China, I left a few copies with friends, and then I continued my trip, and something interesting happened, which has changed the fate of these poems. Because a few weeks after our visit to Beijing, Haiyan and I met with Han Dong. And of course, we talked about, well, everything, and about books especially, and about poetry even more. And so I looked into a translated poetry book, and I read the foreword by a certain Michiel van Krevel. And of course, that is a Dutch name. And I am Dutch. So I thought, now I know someone in Europe who I could, well, contact. Little time after I was back in America, where I live, I wrote a word to Michiel van Krevel. I discovered was the major professor of the Leiden University Institute of China, which is one of the most prestigious, oldest institutes of Chinese studies in Europe. You know how Holland had a lot of contacts in the East Asia since many centuries. So I presented XuYunuo as an unknown poet to Michiel van Krevel, but he answered me immediately saying, well, the world expert on XuYunuo is a certain Michel Hawks, also a Dutchman, also from Leiden. However, now he is the director of the Liu Institute in Notre Dame University in the United States. So I contacted Michel Hawks, and indeed, he sent me his 1993 article, almost 30 years old, called Art for Whose Sake? The Poetry of XuYunuo and the Aesthetic Principles of He Sheng Tao. That was definitely the introduction of XuYunuo in modern times to the West, written in English and maybe read by other Chinese scholars. The next year, 1994, Michel Hawks presented his doctoral thesis, in which he republished a version of his article on XuYunuo amidst articles on this famous book, published also in 1922, which we translate as A Snowy Morning. Xue Zhao. 8 Chinese poets on the road to modernity. In other words, XuYunuo was not altogether unknown in English in the West. I discovered an anthology of Chinese modern poets published already in 1992 by Michel Ye. Some 6 poems chosen from several books of XuYunuo were translated here. I learned about another anthology of Chinese modern poetry in Canada this time by Mr. Bat and Zitner, Flowering of Modern Chinese Poetry, it is called, and was published in 2016, and they also gave some room to XuYunuo. The other thing that I understood was how incredibly difficult it is to have modern Chinese poetry, modernist, 20th century Chinese poetry published in translation in any Western country. Michel Hawkes invited him to come to this forum. Unfortunately, he couldn't, but we had a little discussion about XuYunuo, and he told me how in 1992 and 3, when he worked on XuYunuo and Ye Shengtao, he worked with a photocopy of the book. And he told me he didn't even realize that it was a copy of the 2nd edition of The Future Garden. And now he said recently he discovered something else, that in America, where almost no copies of XuYunuo's poem book exist, there is, however, one in Michigan University Library, which is, however, the 4th edition of the book. So we discovered that XuYunuo was sufficiently important in China in the 20s that the commercial press, still in 1926, was happy to present a 4th edition of the book. Now, still, I thought it was not without necessity that I worked on a presentation of XuYunuo's Future Garden that I thought so important for the history of poetry in China as well as in the world. So let me say a few words about the introduction that I presented for all. Let me say there are 3 main parts of this introduction. You know the title I gave to it? The Chinese Rambo. Because I think that that is an interesting parallel to the one who can be considered at the beginning of a new period in Chinese poetry. And the first chapters of this book go about the writing, the publication, and also about the character, the typical character of the poems. There's one thing that I stress with great insistence. Until today, in English, there have only been chosen poems from the Future Garden translated. One here, one there, and still another that pleased for one or other reason. And I say the Future Garden was composed and later also published in a very short time, only a few weeks, which makes you feel that for XuYunuo there was great urgency to publish. And the few weeks mean to me that the poems work together. You can only understand one poem in the context of every other one. For me, the interesting consequence of realizing this is that, as such, it comes closer to certain English books of the time. Think of Ezra Pound. The second part of my introduction, one chapter indeed, is about the relationship of XuYunuo with Lu Xun. Lu Xun, who certainly is the most studied poet and prose writer of China of this period. I think that while very few precise data are known to us all, to interpret them in a new way gives us a very interesting view both on the poems of XuYunuo, but also on the poems of Lu Xun. I comment, between other things, on the titles. While XuYunuo published A Future Garden, Lu Xun, probably in answer to XuYunuo, published Weeds. Then the third part of the introduction makes comparisons with the Western poetic situation. And in order to make this possible, seeing the vastness of poetic enterprises in the beginning of the 20th century, I have chosen to focus on the year of publication, 1922. And let me tell you that the harvest was rich. First of all, you all know Bertrand Russell. You know how important he was in the beginning of the 20s in China. He stayed a whole year lecturing. He almost died, by the way, in China. And in 1922, he published his long and very influential essay on China. I thought it was interesting to realize that that China is the China of the Future Garden. Even more interesting to me seemed that Russell's friend T.S. Eliot published in 1922, only a few months after The Future Garden, his most famous book, The Waste Land. Do you realize again the parallel between the titles, The Waste Land and The Future Garden? Then another friend of Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein published in the year 1920 the most important book of philosophy of the time, the Tractatus Logicus. In this book, Wittgenstein goes not only against the theories of Bertrand Russell, but he proposes a new way of treating words, trying to understand words in order to communicate or let them out and not communicate through them. The year 1922 gave me more interesting parallels. Did you ever realize that Ulysses by James Joyce was published only a few months before XuYunuo? That Proust got his first recognition, public recognition, the Goncourt Award in 1922? That Kafka, this other great name of Western literature, finished his last book, because he didn't publish them, finished his last book in 1922, before he would fall ill and die in 1924. All these revolutionary publications happened in 1922. I thought it was important to realize that XuYunuo was one of them. This was the reason for me to publish the poem in English, to get it published by a Western publisher. It was not so easy. You know, in our time, first of all, you have to find a publisher. But the publisher will say, well, you have to find the funds too. I was helped, speaking about the funds, by the enthusiasm of Shi Daguan, as well as, of course, Siesling, who send money from China to Europe, to my publisher, and I want to thank them for this. But I had to discover the signs of friendship of many friends in Europe. And I mentioned some in the book itself. My publisher, Arte Libro, did a very beautiful job. He understood the importance of this book. As soon as that was published, I contacted all the most important universities and Chinese institutes in Europe and the United States, Canada, and so you must know that now Harvard, Yale, Leiden, Heidelberg, Paris, Lyon, Vancouver, Prague, all these institutes possess a copy of the poems of XuYunuo. And before I leave you, I want to give you a little extra thing to study. In the same time as I was writing about XuYunuo, I discovered another poet from China of those years, Liu Banong, and especially his famous song, Say How Can I Not Miss Her? And you know that this song has been praised in many ways also because of the introduction always called the first introduction into Chinese of the pronoun, of the character for the pronoun she, ta, feminine ta. And I wrote a little book about this song for the Western people so they could sing with the Chinese. But when working on this, I discovered that the famous song was published not in 1920, but in 1923. Before that date, nobody in the world had seen the ta published in a poem. But in 1922, XuYunuo used the character in 2 places in his future garden. So my hypothesis is that XuYunuo was the first writer to use ta in an important book of poetry. Thank you very much.